Well, we're in Romans 9, and just to summarise where we're at in this book, Paul is in anguish because of his countrymen. He looks around at the typical Jew of his day, and he sees people rejecting Jesus and rejecting the gospel of Jesus, which is a disaster, because without Jesus and without the gospel, there can only ever be fearful judgment. How can this be, Paul asks? How can Israel, God's chosen people, be perishing? That's the problem that Paul is dealing with in Romans chapters 9 to 11. And last time we saw how Paul began to tackle this. And this is what Paul said. He said that privilege is not the same as promise. Yes, God had set his love upon the nation of Israel. He had showered that nation with privilege and with blessing. And yet, God's promises were always addressed to his remnant, to the true Israel, the Israel within the Israel. Nowhere did God promise that every single ethnic Israelite across all of time would be saved. God had always chosen some and rejected others. Salvation was never solely a matter of outward privilege nor race. It was always a matter of grace, of God's sovereign elective choice. And Paul has given us an example. Esau and Jacob, both sons of Isaac, but only Jacob is chosen. And so throughout history, all through the Bible and into our day, God has chosen some from a wider whole to be his remnant people. Now that summarises, I think, the first 13 verses of chapter 9. But Paul has a lot more to say because he knows that this is provocative stuff. After all, it begs some pretty difficult questions about God's character, God's purposes. Is God guilty of not keeping his promises, of being unfaithful? Why does God act in this way? And that's why at this point, Paul presses the pause button on the question of Israel, and he wants to talk about the wider issue of how God operates in his world, God's sovereignty. And I'm here to say, as you probably guessed when we had the reading, this is a difficult passage. It's not easy for us to grasp, not because it's in difficult language, but because it's very emotive. It is difficult for us to hear this. So we need to pray that the Lord will help us to guard our own emotions and guard our own hearts as we go through this. And I think Paul recognises that this is difficult stuff. It's why he adopts this literary device. It was a device common in the Greco-Roman world, the diatribe. He's used it before. He frames his argument as a conversation, and he imagines that he's addressing an opponent, and this opponent is arguing with him. Now, I should say these are not merely hypothetical questions. I would be pretty certain that they are genuine objections that Paul has heard more than once during his ministry. But Paul does it this way to try to bring it alive, to make it real. This isn't just dry college academia. These things really matter. And what we're going to do today is look at these two big objections that Paul presents us with in this chapter. So the first is in verse 14. What then shall we say? Is God unjust or unrighteous? Now remember what triggered this question. Paul has just said something difficult. In verses 11 and 12, he said that before Jacob and Esau were even born, they'd not had any chance to do anything good or bad. God had already made his choice to love Jacob, to reject Esau. And we might think, well, isn't that a bit unfair? I mean, to our minds, it seems a bit arbitrary, and it's like God on a whim went, I think, I'll go for Jacob, and I won't go for Esau. And we think, well, poor old Esau. He didn't stand a chance, did he? Imagine not even being chosen, and he grew up and he'd already been rejected before he'd done anything. We'd perhaps understand it more if God had decided to sort of look into the future and see which of the boys turned out best. Or perhaps if God had simply waited until they'd grown up, perhaps they were age 30, and then he made a discerning choice over who deserved to be chosen. But that's not what happened, is it? Paul is very clear, verse 12, not by works, but by him who calls. And verse 16, it does not therefore depend on man's desire or effort. And that's something I think that confuses and infuriates our human minds. And it appears to lay God open to the charge of being unjust or unrighteous, of just sort of randomly at whim picking some people out to be saved and rejecting other equally worthy candidates. And we might say, well, surely at least, come on, Lord, give us the chance to be judged according to how we've lived. And Paul defends God's justice in a rather unusual way. He defends it by proclaiming God's mercy. In verse 15, he quotes from a conversation that God had with Moses on Mount Sinai. It's in Exodus chapter 33. And here's the context of that chapter. Israel, as they were wont to do, had sinned against God. Despite receiving the law on the mountain, and they'd heard the very voice of God, Israel had quickly lost faith. They'd made a golden calf, and God was angry, rightfully so, and he threatened to destroy Israel and start all over with Moses. And Moses had interceded for the people, and God answered Moses' prayer and promised not to wipe out Israel, but Moses wanted reassurance that God's presence really would remain with Israel. I mean, with good reason, because even though God had relented, he had still struck down 3,000 Israelites. God's wrath was terrifying. Moses' faith needed strengthening. So Moses asked to see the glory of God, to see what makes God who he is, and to thus be certain that this God would never leave his people. Now, of course, Moses asked the impossible because no one can just see God and live. And yet God accommodates Moses. No, Moses couldn't see the full extent of God's glory, but he could at least hear about God's glory from God himself. And God says to Moses, I will cause all my goodness to pass in front of you, and I will proclaim my name, the name of the Lord, in your presence. I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I have compassion. So you want to see my glory, says God? Well, listen up, Moses. Let me tell you about it. I'm merciful. I'm the God of mercy. And I show it whenever I choose to whomever I choose, because I'm God. I'm sovereign. You see, often we get it mixed up. We say, well, why hasn't God saved those people? But the question is really, why has God saved anyone? You see, in the face of Israel's sin, every last Israelite deserved to die. And yet God chose to show mercy to many of them. Not because he was manipulated or argued into it, not because he was coerced, but because he freely chose to. It's his sovereign right. He is God. He is king. And because of who he is the very epitome of mercy. And God is always unswervingly true to his nature. He's internally consistent. He never acts in a way that denies his name. I do all the time. I might say one thing and do another, not God. And Paul says that the God of the Old Testament, Moses' God, is the God of the gospel age as well. He's unchanging. And the basis for his saving choice remains his sovereignty and his character. It's not about God being unfair to anyone or overlooking worthy candidates for heaven, because there are no worthy candidates for heaven. Paul said in Romans 3, all have sinned, all fall short of the glory of God. In other words, we all inherit Adam's sin. We're born into the world with it, and then we add to it with some of our own sin. And our sin separates us from God. It makes us orphans in this fallen world, and God's justice rightfully demands that we eventually pay the ultimate price, eternal separation from him. And yet, the sovereign God, who is free to act entirely as he pleases, happens to be a merciful God. And he will not and he cannot deny himself. And so while he will uphold justice in his world, because that's who he is, he also exercises his sovereign freedom to extend mercy to some, because that's who he is too. And in doing that, he remains righteous, internally consistent, true to himself. God, in his righteousness, will ensure that every single person who has ever lived in this world receives one of two things. Either his righteous justice, which is exactly what they deserve, or his glorious, bountiful mercy. And sometimes in the strangeness of God's providence, mercy and justice actually collide. Consider what Paul says in verses 17 and 18. He goes back to Exodus and he takes the example of Pharaoh, the wicked king of Egypt, who refuses to let the enslaved Israelites free. You'll probably remember the story. Time and time again, Moses comes to him and he refuses, and God has to send plagues to afflict the Egyptians. And yet time and time again, Pharaoh hardens his heart and he refuses to let Israel go. But it wasn't just a case of a very wicked man thwarting God's plans and God had to try and find a solution. Because even as Pharaoh hardened his own heart, we are told repeatedly in Exodus, the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. No, he wasn't inciting Pharaoh to sin. He wasn't endorsing Pharaoh's sin, but he was abandoning Pharaoh to his sins. And it's something that Paul spoke of in Romans 1, of God giving people over. And he still does it today. It is a judicial act of the king, of the sovereignty of God. It's invisible to us. But he hardens people who repeatedly despise him and suppress his truth. People who do not want his mercy. And he does it so that they may be ever seeing, but never perceiving, ever hearing, but never understanding. Now that's quite a truth. And we might ask, well, is that fair? Is it fair and fair? I mean, if God hadn't hardened Pharaoh, would Pharaoh have actually been a rather warm, cuddly sort of guy who would have been well disposed to let Israel go? Well, I think we know the answer to that. Nobody deserves mercy. All have sinned, and certainly Pharaoh was no saint. He was already a wicked tyrant. He was already oppressing God's people. He had enslaved them in Egypt, and he loved his sin. He loved his free slave force. And so God gave him over to his sin. Pharaoh already deserved justice, and justice is what he assuredly received. But in hardening him, in giving him over to his sin, confirming him in his rebellion, God did something amazing. Because Paul quotes Exodus 9, where God says to Pharaoh, I raised you up for this very purpose, that I might display my power in you, and that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth. So God hardened Pharaoh's heart to demonstrate his awesome divine power by bringing justice and mercy through the exact same events. Deserved judgment for the wicked, godless king of Egypt, and redemption for his people Israel. Only God could do that in one fell swoop. And that is God. That's our God. Gloriously free and able to be himself, to be the God who judges justly and yet shows mercy. And he's everyone's God, whether people like it or not. And either you are a debtor to his mercy or you are under his justice. The question is, which are you going to choose? Now, one of my commentaries, Daniel Doriani, I think that's how you pronounce his name, tells the story of a university student who was finding it hard to concentrate on the lectures because the professor spoke a bit too fast. And one day he discovered an old recording of the class lectures. So he decided to stop attending the lectures, and instead he remained at home and he listened to the lectures on the recording, and he would read the books in the curriculum. And do you know what? He made really good progress. Unfortunately, because he wasn't in the actual class, he missed various announcements to do with the course requirements. Therefore, he didn't write the book review and he didn't write the term paper, which represented half the grade. And unsurprisingly, he failed the course and he was enraged. And he went and sought out the professor and he said, look, you lecture too fast. So I had to learn another way. And I did. And I've worked really hard. And I've gained all this knowledge. And I demand that you give me justice. Give me the grade that I deserve. And the wise professor replied, If you'd asked for mercy, I would have granted it. But you've demanded justice, and behold, you have received it. You see, when unbelievers rail against God and they demand justice, I think they're taking leave of their senses. They're effectively asking God to judge them on the basis of their works, whereas they should be pleading for mercy. Because mercy is their only hope, and it's our only hope today. The mercy of the righteous God, which is freely offered to us in his Son Jesus Christ. Justice is what we deserve for our sins. And if we spurn the wonderful mercy of God, well, justice is what we will receive. Now, this leads on to Paul's second question in verse 19. Paul has given us a picture of a formidably powerful God who seems to decide the destiny of people before they're born. He saves some. He brings justice to others. He hardens them in their sins. And it begs the question, why does God still blame us? For who resists his will? In other words, can any of us truly be held responsible? I mean, what genuine agency do we really think we have? God is God. He's irresistible. You've just shown us that, Paul. Even people who resist him, like Pharaoh, are being judiciously hardened by God. So why should sinners be blamed for not trusting God if God hasn't chosen them anyway? Now, interestingly, Paul doesn't give a direct answer to that. He doesn't tell us how divine sovereignty and human accountability interact. He doesn't go into some apologetics. Not because he was intellectually incapable of doing it, and not because Paul was someone who tried to avoid difficult questions, but because Paul realizes that this particular question betrays something ugly and rebellious, which is why Paul comes up with three counter questions of his own. Who are you, O man, to talk back to God? Shall what is formed say to him who formed it, why did you make me like this? Does not the potter have the right to make out of the same lump some pottery for noble purposes and some for common use? Now, there's nothing wrong with genuine Christians who wrestle with their faith and come to the Lord with real questions. There's nothing wrong with that at all. But there is presumption and arrogance in this particular objection. Paul describes it as talking back. Basically, it's back chat. It is the child being a bit lippy to their mum and dad, or the pupil answering back to the teacher in the class. It's someone basically saying, well, how dare God choose Jacob over Esau? Who does God think he is? How dare God not choose people on their merit? I mean, who are you, God, to decide my destiny? And Paul is saying, hang on a minute. Well, who are you? I mean, God is sovereign. We know that God is the creator of this world. He made it. He sustains it every day. He made you and me. So how he runs his world is up to him. But you're just finite. You're a creature of dust. He's up there. He's infinite. He's the forever God. It's not for you, here today, gone tomorrow, to correct God or to try and pass judgment on him. Do you see what God sees? Do you have his vantage point? Do you see the end from the beginning? So who are you to pass judgment? Now, Paul develops this by using an analogy, and it's not an exact one, so we don't want to stretch it too far, but it's a biblical one. You can find it in places like Isaiah 45 and Jeremiah 18, and it's the potter and the clay. And the potter has absolute mastery over this lump of clay. He can use it to mould, to fashion whatever he wants. He might use it to make a humble water jar. Perhaps he'll make it to fashion something ornamental that he might sell at a high price. It's entirely up to him. Whatever the object, it's his prerogative. He's in charge. He has the might. He has the right. And Paul is saying, well, that's God compared to us. Now, yes, we are creatures of value and dignity, but only because we were made in the image of God. And we're not God. He is. And as our creator, he has the might and he has the right to do with us as he chooses, to make some for noble purposes and some for common use. Now, this is obviously evidently true, isn't it, in everyday life. Some people are given extraordinary gift and capability by God. Others are given far more modest gifts. Some people become famous and powerful, and others don't. And we could kick against that. We could fantasize and lust after what we don't have, but it's futile. God has made us the way he's made us, and contentment in this life comes from trusting that sovereign God, who sees the end from the beginning, who knows me better than I know myself, has put me exactly where he wants me to be and has fitted me for that life. And that is God's right as our Creator and as our Lord. But I think this also speaks of something deeper and more startling, that from this big lump of clay, from the mass of humanity, God fashions some people whom he destines to inherit salvation, and others he destines for wrath. He has the might and he has the right to do this. And as we've seen with Esau and Jacob, this is how God operates in his world. Now, no, we can't stretch this analogy too far. We are not inert lumps of clay. We are people, real people, with dignity and value, and yet God is far, far above us. And he has the same power and freedom and authority to do whatever he wills with us as a potter has with his clay. Now, I appreciate that this is very hard for us to accept, because you see, every single one of us in this room has been brought up and conditioned upon the lie that human beings are sovereign, that we are kings of our own world, that we have autonomy to decide our destiny. That's basically the plot of every Hollywood fantasy film. It is extremely difficult, even as believers, to wean ourselves off that kind of thinking and to accept that God has that power and we don't. But we must accept this, and it's not my opinion. I'm not making this up. This is God's word. And Paul is going to double down in verse 22. He says, what if God, choosing to show his wrath and make his power known, bore with great patience the objects of his wrath, prepared for destruction? Now, don't be deceived by the what if translation there. It doesn't mean, well, this is just hypothetical. Rather, it means if, as he does, God operates in this way, who are you to complain? And you might think, well, that doesn't help matters, Paul. We might protest, well, God is apparently creating people in order to send them to hell. What kind of a good God does that? Well, I think there are one or two things that we can say in answer to that. Number one, God does not create people who are longing for a relationship with him only to turn around and say to them, tough, sorry, you're destined for wrath. Because you see, the truth is, because of sin, nobody longs for a relationship with God. But for God's intervention, as sure as night follows day, we will always choose sin, because sin is our will. And so if, as we saw with Pharaoh, God judicially confirms sinners in their rebellion and prepares them for the wrath to come, he is righteous to do so. He is just. And you know, from one perspective, God is merciful to do so, because hell is full of people who ultimately receive what they wanted to receive, an existence without any kind of relationship with God. To be with God in a perfect paradise, but with an evil heart, would be an awful thing. And God spares sinners that fate. Number two, let it not be said that God is hasty in his justice. I know I can be hasty in wanting to get even or get things done properly, but Paul says that God bore with great patience the objects of his wrath. And we get a sense of his patience towards sinful Israel in the next chapter. Paul quotes from Isaiah in Romans 10:21. All day long I have held out my hands to a disobedient and obstinate people. So God allows sinners to live and breathe in his world. He doesn't strike them dead the moment they're born. And in some cases, he allows them to enjoy extraordinary privilege. And they never thank him for it. Grace is routinely spurned by both Jew and Gentile. only compounding their guilt. And yet the God who has no obligation to be so generous and so patient still is. And then number 3, the wrath that some are prepared for is not random, it's not arbitrary. There is a clear purpose. God is choosing to show his wrath and make his power known. You see, a God with no teeth is no God. A God whose bark is worse than his bite is no God. But just as he did with Pharaoh and Egypt, the Lord delays final judgment in order that it might be fully unveiled one day and be all the more terrible, and thus magnify his power and his name, that he is a God worthy of the name. He is truly God. He really is opposed to sin and wickedness, and he is truly just, and he's able and powerful and willing to deal with sin and evil once for all. And the Lord also does it so that his glory might shine brighter to those he has chosen to show mercy to. Verse 23, what if he did this to make the riches of his glory known to the objects of his mercy, whom he prepared in advance for glory? I mean, if the Lord was saving us from something that was quite mild, then did Christ really need to suffer? And would not being saved be such a big deal? But of course we know that sin is a massive insult and offence to God. It's ugly and it incurs his just wrath. And yet the God who is just is also full of mercy, and wrath accentuates mercy. Listen to how one writer puts it. The mercy of God wouldn't be impressed on the consciousness of human beings apart from the exercise of God's wrath. Just as you delight more richly in the warmth and the beauty and the tenderness of spring after you've experienced the cold blast of a winter. And don't we see that at Calvary? Such a dark event in human history. The apex of human wickedness. God's own Son put to death by wicked men. And what a sad event it was. The white heat of God's wrath poured out upon an innocent man, upon the Christ who did no wrong, who'd only ever shown love and kindness to everybody, being put to death. A terrible event, a sad event. And yet, at the same time, it was no accident. It happened according to God's foreknowledge. And Jesus hung there knowingly and gladly for his people. He swallowed up the agony that we deserve. And so you've got an extraordinary combination, haven't you? What appeared to be a defeat was a glorious triumph. And the darkest day was also the brightest day. God's power was manifest. Heaven's peace and perfect justice kissed a guilty world in love. And I think it had to be this way, because how much more can a believer appreciate the depths of God's mercy in the backdrop of Christ's agony at Calvary? We sing an old hymn that says, mercy there was great and grace was free. Pardon there was multiplied to me. There my burdened soul found liberty at Calvary. And how much greater because of the suffering that Christ went through for us. Now, Paul isn't quite done yet, because perhaps the question for his readers at this point is, well, who are these fortunate people? Who are these recipients of mercy? Because remember, Paul has his own people at the forefront of his mind. Israelites are perishing. Gentiles are being saved. Has God just forgotten all his promises? And has he grown cold and got bored? And has he moved on? And verse 24 gives us Paul's clear answer as to who this people is. Who are the recipients of God's mercy? Even us, whom he also called, not only from the Jews, but also from the Gentiles. So God's merciful plans include both Jew and Gentile. And that was always God's plan. There'd be no change of plan here. Remember what we said at the beginning. God's salvation was never a matter of race or privilege. It was always a matter of God's electing grace. That's why Paul said back in verse 6, not all who are descended from Israel are Israel. It is not the natural children who are God's children. It is the children of the promise who are regarded as Abraham's offspring. So in other words, God's saving promises in the Old Testament weren't for every Israelite per se. They were always for his remnant, the true Israel within Israel. And what's more, the true Israel within Israel always included Gentiles. Even in the Old Testament, there were Gentiles, weren't there, included in God's promises. Rahab, Ruth, Naaman, and so on. And many more were anticipated. What was God's very first promise to Abraham? That through him, all peoples on earth would be blessed. You don't believe me? Paul says. Well, take a closer look at the Jewish scriptures. Paul gives us 4 different quotations, 2 from Hosea, 2 from Isaiah, that make this point. The Gentiles were called too. The Gentiles were included. It's not a case of God being unfair to anyone. It's a case of the expansion of God's mercy and grace. Consider verse 25. I will call them my people who are not my people, and I'll call her my loved one who is not my loved one. Now that was originally a prophecy spoken by the prophet Hosea to the northern tribes of Israel. People who were apostate, people who were away from God and headed for judgment. And yet Hosea prophesies that one coming day, God is going to show mercy to Israel again. And we might think, well, yeah, sure, great. That was for Israel. Nothing to do with us. Not so, says Paul. Because God was actually speaking of his remnant. You see, most of Israel in Hosea's day didn't care about God. They were secular. In fact, most of Israel throughout Old Testament history didn't care about God. And that's the point of the 2 later prophecies from Isaiah. Verse 27, though the number of the Israelites be like the sand by the sea, only the remnant will be saved. Unless the Lord Almighty had left us descendants, we would have become like Sodom. We would have become like Gomorrah. And Israel deserved judgment as much as those 2 wicked cities. And yet despite this, God gave her descendants. He preserved a believing remnant. It was a miracle of God's grace and mercy. And it was true of Hosea's day. God had reserved this remnant who loved him. And they grieved at the wickedness around them. They feared God's judgment. And to these people, these faithful few, Hosea is speaking God's words of promise and hope. I will call them my people who are not my people. In other words, I'm here, says God. I'm sovereign. I'm in control. I have good plans for you. I will turn hearts back to me. Look to me. Trust me. Wait for me. Just see what I'm going to do. And what not even Hosea perhaps fully realized was that extraordinary promise went far beyond Israel. Because that remnant people of God's would include many Gentiles, people alienated from God, outside of the covenant, and yet in God's mercy called and included. Now, can this really be true? Can we here today really appropriate this Old Testament prophecy for ourselves? Paul says you can, because Paul does. The church has been grafted into Israel, and we too are inheritors of these same promises. We stand in the same line of faith, spiritual descendants of Abraham. And there's a lot of parallels. Just like in Hosea's day, God's people today are weak. We are a remnant. I did a bit of research across our country today. About 8 to 9% of the population will be attending a church. And not all of those will be saved people. We are a tiny body comparatively. We are a mere remnant. And yet we are God's remnant. We're grafted into Israel. We stand in our faith and we cling to God's mercy, not our own works. We are a miracle of his grace. And we're a varied remnant because there is a wideness to God's mercy. His church in the world is Jew and Gentile. It is old and young. It is rich and poor. It is male and female. Those seemingly lost and adrift have been brought in from the cold. And this was always God's plan throughout Bible history, says Paul. It is still God's plan today. And that means, and here's the wonderful truth, that if God could have brought Gentiles in from the cold, can he not one future day bring Israel back in from the cold? You see, it's the kind of surprising, patient, merciful act of the God that we've talked about today, of who he is. And as we're going to find out later in chapter 11, this is God's great plan. And we end with this question: is that kind of a surprising, merciful, patient, just God really unrighteous? Yes, He's vast. Otherwise, he wouldn't be worthy of the name God, would he? His ways are higher than our ways. And yes, his ways are often mysterious, baffling to us. Unlike him, we don't see the end from the beginning, so we can't appreciate fully what's going on. All we see are people rejecting the gospel, perhaps people we love, and we grieve for them, and we wonder, are they headed for hell? What are you doing, Lord? But what we can say is that whatever God may be doing, this God is always just and yet always merciful, and is therefore never unrighteous. And that means that we can trust him. We can trust him for our lives. We can trust our loved ones to him, that he will, the judge of all the earth, will do right. There's an old hymn by Samuel Medley that says this: God shall alone the refuge be and comfort of my mind, too wise to be mistaken he, too good to be unkind. In all his holy sovereign will he is, I daily find, too wise to be mistaken still, too good to be unkind. Though I cannot see his goings nor his footsteps find, too wise to be mistaken he, too good to be unkind. That's the God of Romans 9. And may the Lord help us to trust him for his grace and his mercy, that he really is too wise to be mistaken, and he's too good to be unkind, and he offers his mercy freely to each of us today. Amen.